Hello, friends. As promised, our enlightened friend on geopolitics and Israeli politics, Mr. Owen Alterman, who is senior correspondent on international affairs in I-24 News Israel, is back with us, and he promised us that let the results come of Israeli elections. He will once again come to us and he will inform us what can be the permutations and combinations, as always, which takes place in Israel. So, welcome, Owen.
Hey, great to be back.
Let me start with the biggest question of today's world. How is COVID doing there? Because in India, it's
Listen,
doing havoc.
listen. I hope that gonna upset too many people. We're doing great. I mean, we have the best vaccine drive in the world.
I
Pretty
know.
much everything is open. Whatever rules are left are in some cases falling apart. Some of the education system is still under some pretty strict restrictions because, again, kids under 16 here, as the rest of the world, aren't vaccinated. There are some restrictions at the airport, and obviously foreign arrivals still pretty much all banned. But other than that, the country's pretty much open, especially if you've been vaccinated. Hotels are open, restaurants, even nightclubs, theaters, you name it. So there are still some restrictions. Case numbers are just terrific. Our R is something like 0.6. Our test positive rate is something like 1%. And our number of new cases a day, something like 3 per 100,000, 4 per 100,000. So it's really, really terrific. 5 per 100,000, maybe. So it's really, the numbers are great. This is, again, while the country is open, while we've gone through a few cycles of Jewish holidays, and really so far so good. So again, the vaccine drive, essentially, it's almost reaching its end. There are very few Israelis at this point getting their first shots. So whoever wanted to get vaccinated or could get vaccinated has pretty much already been vaccinated, and we're getting the benefits. So that, at least in this pandemic, Israel's led the world, and we've seen terrific results.
Fantastic. And so my message to my fellow Indians is that whenever your chance, your turn for COVID vaccine comes, do not hesitate. Go straight forward, get yourself vaccinated. We are seeing the results in Israel, and let me tell you, Israel is number one in vaccinating the population. So good luck to you guys. Good luck to us as well. Now coming
Absolutely.
to another virus, that is the election virus of Israel, because there is no vaccine for election virus in Israel. Four times in 2 years, my God, what you guys are doing? And still it's a hung house.
Yeah, and we might be back for round five sometime in the late summer or in the fall. Listen, we had, as you know, this is our fourth set of elections in 2 years. The results this time, if anything, Gulriz, even more complicated, even a tougher puzzle to try to put together a government than the first three. So it's fascinating to watch what the politicians are going to do. That said, the way the process works here is that after the election, there's a lot of time given to the parties to make decisions about what they want to do, to have the process of negotiation. So it feels like it all moves in slow motion. And to this point, again, elections were about almost 2 weeks ago at this point. There's really only been one important thing that's happened, which is that the one of the parties that supports Prime Minister Netanyahu has ruled out support from an Arab party that might be willing to support the coalition. I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself in giving the explanation. So let me actually take a step back. As we talked about before Election Day, there are still three scenarios. And with these results, all three of those scenarios are still live. One, a pro-Netanyahu coalition. Two, a motley crew that comes together for some kind of anti-Netanyahu coalition, and a continued deadlock in a fifth election. All of those three scenarios are still live. And of course, if nothing happens, we go to a fifth election. But the question is, can we form a coalition of one form or another? If you look at the pro-Netanyahu side, he has 52 seats in 120 in the 120 member parliament that are locked up. He could get another 7 by signing on a guy named Naftali Bennett and his party that's called the Yamina Party. And we'll talk about Bennett a little bit later. And that would get Netanyahu to 59, which is close, but not good enough because he needs 61 because that's the majority. So he needs another 2 seats. The easiest way for Netanyahu to get there is, as it turns out, by getting the support in one form or another by an Arab party called the Ra'am Party. And this party, over the course of the elections, led by a guy named Mansour Abbas, I think we'll talk about it a little bit later, basically told his voters this: we are not going to sit out Israeli politics. I want us to go in and basically to do deals, not just with the center and the left, not just with those who have opinions on the Palestinian issue that are maybe closer to ours, but we want to even do deals with the right because we're interested in budgets for our communities and representation and power. And we'll go to the highest bidder. And that's what he said he would do before the election. And that's what he's continued to do since the election. And if Netanyahu and his full block of 59 seats that he would bring to the table were all willing to accept that support, because the Ram Party has 4 seats, that would give them more than the 61 that they need. What's the problem for Netanyahu? Well, the problem has cropped up, or I should say been sharpened, in the 2 weeks since elections. Within that block of 59 is a party that has 6 seats called the Religious Zionism Party, a kind of hard right party from the core of the settlement movement, religious. So he has a certain ideological point of view. And the leader of that party has come and said, in no uncertain terms, no way, no how, I am not going to be involved in any government that gets support from this Arab party, okay, that has its own Islamist leanings and so forth, that he says are leanings that are against the existence of the Jewish state. There's some truth to this, we should say, by the way. He's not necessarily distorting the record. And he said, it doesn't matter what they say they'll do. Doesn't matter what kind of speeches they gave. And the leader of this party gave a major speech in Israeli television live in primetime hours a few days ago. We aren't going to accept it. And if he goes with that all the way, the numbers aren't there for Netanyahu. Because without that party, you have to subtract 6. So he has 53 plus the 4 from Ram. He only has 57. He doesn't have enough. So that means Netanyahu is stuck, at least with the easiest way for him to get to that magic number. Okay? He may have a few other ways to try to get there, but to simplify, we'll put that aside right now. Go to the second option, which is that Netanyahu's opponents come together and put together a government that could get support in the parliament. They too need 61. To make a long story short, on a good day, if they all come together, they have 58. And then they too need the support of one of the 2 Arab parties or Arab lists in the Israeli parliament. And they need, importantly, that whole 58 to come together. And what's the problem there? That 58 includes parties that are on the hard right, that are on the hard left, and everything in between. They disagree about a lot of issues. They interestingly agree on certain things, but they disagree on a lot of issues. So it's hard to get them together. And even if you get them together, you have to get them to all to agree on accepting support from the Arab party. And that's not easy either. So in both cases, it's a tough road. The doors are not completely shut. There are some potential options for Netanyahu. He'll have to twist some arms in order to get there. There are some potential options for the anti-Netanyahu crowd. They're all going to have to get in the same room, proving to be pretty hard to do. And then they have to twist some arms, but conceivable. And of course, if nothing happens, then we'll keep on being bit by this election virus and go back for round number 5.
So either of the way, it looks like the Arab countries are having the key to the government, or they are the kingmakers right now. But I think, Owen, if this type of Jewish and Arab coalition occurs, will it be a game changer for history and present of Israel? If things go well and these 2 communities come closer in a nationalistic sense, I think it is good for the future of the country.
Listen, it has a real potential. And I think you can disagree with the ideology and the policy positions on Zionism, for example, writ large, of Mansour Abbas and his party. But there's no question that he did something very brave, and that's a real precedent. And you said a real game changer, which is he went to his voters and he said, I want to do business with the Zionist parties. I want to do business with the Jewish political parties. I want to treat them as I want to normalize our relations with them, to borrow the phrase that we use in terms of Israel's foreign policy. And yeah, that's very different. And to go on Israeli television and give that kind of speech that he did to the Jewish public, we hear that kind of speech from Arabs on the street in Israel all the time. I mean, there are many, many people who share that view, okay? But to hear it from a political leader was, yes, it was different. And let alone, the thing that's important to understand is Mansour Abbas is only one person. The number of seats he has in the parliament are 4 seats.
So
But
just
he
four
went out
seats.
and convinced hundreds of thousands of people to vote for him. He didn't play a bait and switch, right? He didn't, before the election, say, I'm not going to do any business with the Jewish parties, and then after the election change his mind. He told his voters exactly what he wanted to do. And they voted for him either despite that or because of that.
No, because
And
of
it
that.
shows that there are people either who support this idea or who are open to it. And yes, if it actually happens, it would be something genuinely new because it would involve him getting concessions and budgets that in a way that hasn't happened in the past in Israeli politics for an Arab political party to have that kind of achievement. You're absolutely right. It could be, it is something new, even if it doesn't bear fruit right now. By the way, it could bear fruit down the road. And that's why this speech that he gave a few days ago was important in terms of the math of putting together the coalition, right? The question, was he going to convince these right-wing parties, and this one right-wing party I keep talking about in particular, to come around? The answer there was no. But it still could be important at a deeper level for exactly the reasons you're talking about, because it talked about something much deeper that's happening in Israeli society. And you're right, that could potentially be very, very positive. We'll have to see. But in terms of the here and now question of what does it do to the coalitions, it failed in its narrow goal of giving a ladder for the right-wing parties. And again, this one particular right-wing party, the Religious Zionist Party, to climb down on and support him. But it may well, of course, have laid the groundwork for something else. And again, we keep talking about the 3 options. Certainly is still a live option for them to support from the outside an anti-Netanyahu government of some kind and get similar kinds of concessions from that side of the political spectrum. That would include, even in that case, some right-wing parties. So, yeah.
So let me just enlarge my canvas and paint a bigger picture. Can it be this Mansour Abbas movement? If he supports and form a government with the right-wing parties, can it be a movement like that of Ahmad Sidat? Ahmad Sidat was coming from foreign, and he's the internal guy from Israel itself. So can we just say that it is a Ahmad Sidat movement for Israel?
Yeah, listen, I'll be honest. It's hard for me to compare in a sense because I was less than a year old when Anwar Sadat visited Jerusalem. But I think that was different in the sense that was very dramatic. It was just a bolt of lightning, the way people describe that event, that it was so unexpected, it was so stunning, and it was so against the grain of every ideology that was out there in the Arab world at the time that it was simply shocked everyone. Mansour Abbas, on the other hand, is a little bit different in that the trends that enabled him to get support from hundreds of thousands of people, to get enough support to make it into the Israeli parliament, running alone on this message, the trends that led to that have been a long time in coming, have been decades in coming. Standard of living has been rising among Israeli Arabs for decades. Higher percentages of Arab Israelis are enrolling in higher education and getting degrees. Birth rates among Arab Israeli women have been falling for decades as women get more higher levels of education. You know, there are obviously some other trends, right? There's increasing, you could say, nationalism in parts of Israeli society and so forth. We've seen that not necessarily in the last year or two, but maybe a little bit before then. But on the whole, a lot of these trends have been there underneath the surface. They haven't really played out in the parliament, but they've been there. So in that sense, it's a little bit different. And also it's different because Sadat, we know what that led to, right? We know where the story ends. It ends in Camp David with a peace treaty that's held for 40 years. Then it leads into the developments. The 90s ultimately leads to the White House and the Abraham Accords from 7 months ago. We don't know where this is going. So, but sure, it's an important event. You're absolutely right. We shouldn't lose sight of it in the details of the day-to-day headlines, how important it is.
Okay, now let me come to the geopolitical angle of Middle East. There are reports that United States have taken away some batteries of their Patriot missile system from Saudi Arabia. They are also trying to reduce the number of troops at the height of problems between Donald Trump and Iran. There were something around 90,000 troops stationed there in Middle East. And now the numbers are hardly 30,000. And when missile batteries they are taking away, some other installations they are moving away, definitely the troops number will also fall. So how are you looking at this picture sitting from Jerusalem?
Well, first of all, I should say it hasn't made a lot of waves in Israel, this move by the United States. And I think that's because Israelis see the U.S.-Israel relationship as somehow being in a different category. That in some way it's cocooned from these larger processes because it has a special place in American politics. That's how Israelis see it. Maybe that's coming from a point of privilege in a sense, but that's how Israelis, I think, see it and see it as distinct. That said, obviously, no secret that Israel wants the United States to have close relations with Saudi Arabia and with the Gulf states, doesn't want to see the United States pull back from the region, at least in that sense. But on the third hand, look, this is also a trend that's been a long time in coming. The idea of pivoting towards Asia is not a new idea that Joe Biden and Antony Blinken hatched. This was there even before Donald Trump. And we all remember the famous memo from the Defense Department under Obama, right? It was there in the Obama administration. It was certainly, give me 1 second. I got a message from work. Okay, all set. And obviously under Donald Trump, they didn't necessarily pivot towards China in the Obama sense, but they certainly played up the issue of China and made it front and center in American politics. And in this sense, Donald Trump led the American establishment. We've even heard Antony Blinken refer to this in terms of taking a harder line on China, and that reverberates on decisions like this one. One way of thinking about this, and we've talked about this in our conversations before, is that the issues are linked and ultimately might bring the United States back to Saudi Arabia, which is now that China and Iran have signed this big, massive deal, right? This big multi-billion, hundreds of $billion deal. Again, there's a lot of questions surrounding this. Is it really that much money? What do they actually want to do? Where does this go? There are more questions than answers. But let's just say that it actually becomes something important and the Chinese and the Iranians actually develop it. If that happens, it seems to me that the entire U.S. alliance system in the Indo-Pacific, the Quad as we're getting used to calling it, and the whole U.S. or pro-U.S. alliance structure in the Middle East, from the UAE on through to Saudi Arabia, again, despite the recalibration, Saudi Arabia, onward to Israel and Egypt and so forth. And then if you even add on a third set, could say, of alliances between Israel and Cyprus and Greece and the countries that are connected to that, maybe France, because the role they're playing in the Eastern Mediterranean, you could see all these alliance structures linking up. Because the minute that China and Iran are doing business to the degree they're talking about business, and I defer to you on this, it seems to me it's the day when India starts to wonder about what its role is in Iran.
I was telling you, this is
and
going
which
in
side
that
of the
direction.
Middle East India is on, right? Because we know India's relationship, as it stands, India has an important relationship with Iran that it wants to develop and so forth. But maybe that changes. And once that changes, I think that really could have tremendous geopolitical impact. And once that happens, and you're in a kind of true Cold War alliance structure, maybe it brings the United States back to Saudi Arabia as a way of, quote, containing China. Now, there's only one scenario. We're a long way from that. I want to emphasize we're a long way from that. There are plenty of other possible futures, to use that word. And the United States, we even had Antony Blinken saying, I think a week or two ago, saying that at the NATO meeting, he doesn't want to force allies into an us versus them choice on China's stance. We're welcome news in Israel because Israel doesn't want that choice. And if that's the case, then this whole system could develop differently. But if the United States wants to contain China, what does it do in 2021? It moves the Patriot missiles out of Saudi Arabia. But maybe in 2031, the United States moves the Patriot missiles back to Saudi Arabia as a way of containing China. I don't know. It's one possible future. There are others, but it's worth putting out there.
Well, I was thinking on some other line as well. Maybe they are withdrawing, not because of China right now, but maybe because of the number of troops Russia is amassing on the Ukrainian border. Who knows what's going on? We don't know. After 2 months, there is a fight in East Europe.
Also possible. We've seen it before.
Also possible. But let me ask you one more thing then. When you spoke about the Chinese investment and deal, $400 billion US dollar worth deal with Iran. Now, that deal also contained a huge amount of money for infrastructure development, let it be railways or let it be road infrastructure. Though supposedly there is a fight between Israel and Iran, or Saudi Arabia, UAE and Iran. Now, can they target Iran? Because when China is making the infrastructure, when their workers are there, the PLA, People's Liberation Army, it's their motto. It's written in their books that if Chinese workers or Chinese investment is being attacked, it will be taken as a war against China. So, is it not a bigger deterrent for Iran than nuclear install or ballistic installations?
It's an interesting question. And listen, it goes back to the scenario I was just talking about, right? Where the fact that China is based in Iran starts to lead to countries taking sides against China, and then
Yeah,
links up again these alliance structures in the Middle East and in South Asia and East Asia, in the Indo-Pacific rather, in a really interesting way. Are Chinese infrastructure projects in Iran a deterrent for an Israeli military operation in Iran? It's a good question. I suspect that an Israeli military operation in Iran would be targeting military infrastructure proper.
yes.
Would the Chinese be involved in those kinds of projects? I don't know. Is that part of this bargain? I don't know. If it were, I think people here are certainly not be too pleased about that. But I guess the only thing I would say is this. If we're in a scenario where Israel is launching some kind of military operation against Iran, then we're in a scenario of last resort. And if we're in a scenario of last resort, I don't think there would be much that would deter Israel. Again, I think we're far from that. So I don't know that the question would ever be sharpened to that point. But you pose an interesting question of exactly how the rise of China really could change the way that the Middle East is organized in a way, or in some
Because
ways
what's coming
solidify the
on?
way the Middle East
Yeah,
is organized.
yeah.
And this whole
Uh,
U.S. idea of offshore balancing, that whole policy from 10 years ago, completely falls apart because you need to actually be in the Middle East to
yes.
balance because the Chinese are here. There you go.
Because Chinese are there, and what the reports are coming out that the deal is not just about oil and natural gas development or infrastructure development. It is also to do with the development of defense hardware as well as the intelligence sharing with Chinese. And I think, see, I always abuse, actually, the word abuse is proper, the Washington based think tanks, because I think that these think tanks are not having nothing in their head. It's just dirt filled up there. Because, see, till in past 70 years about Middle East, they used to say, until and unless there is a Palestinian solution, Arab states and Israel can't come together. But now Donald Trump has, with the Abraham Accord, failed those theories of those so-called think tanks. Now, even these think tanks and even the policy makers of United States, they have done diplomatic mistakes by putting Iran in the lap of China. The same they are doing with Russia. They are putting Russia also in the lap of China. And why I am saying that? Because Iran doesn't come alone. It comes with a full bouquet. It will come with Iran, it will come with Syria, it will come with Yemen, Lebanon. So diplomatically, they were not able to deal properly. What do you think?
Well, I mean, this is a problem I think Israelis have with the whole diplomacy on Iran is Israelis are reluctant to make concessions to Iran because it would preserve the current balance of power in the region, which people here want to change, right? Iran is in too advantageous a position, and I think the Israeli goal is to knock it down a peg and to reduce the Iranian influence. And what the diplomacy tends to do is enshrine the Iranian influence. Maybe in exchange for that, you get concessions on the nuclear program, but at the same time, you enshrine the Iranian influence in the region. This is, of course, let alone Israel. This is the reason why Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are so angry about the diplomacy, because it does that. And to actually address the regional situation, which is an idea, give me 1 second, you might have to make concessions on still other issues, meaning that it's impossible to change the balance of power in the region unless you actually change the balance of power through economic pressure, military pressure, or through other forms of pressure, internal pressure in Iran. And so that is a kind of a problem that people see with it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but obviously people see that as a problem. And Israel has been acting for years to the very least not allow Iran's influence to grow. And where Israel can, to try to restrict it or even lower it. And in Syria, for example, Israel has arguably lowered it to some degree, at least the Iranian military presence. So I hope that answers your question. I don't know if it does.
Yeah, see, many things will come out in another 1 year or so, and I'm sure that even the Quad will expand with Quad plus countries, even European countries, and maybe Israel will be having some part in that, and the Quad countries, especially India, in that sense, will be having greater say in Middle East. Do you know that we are going to conduct military exercises with United Arab Emirates?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Israel,
Listen, they're
Saudi
conducting
Arabia,
exercises,
India, and UAE,
and
they are a great power.
and
Club
listen, to
them
go back
together.
to my point, that's right. And the UAE is conducting military exercises with Greece. Again,
Greece.
they seem to see these alliance structures as linked. That's maybe the game that they're playing with the Abraham Accords. And now with China, again, it's still an if, we have to emphasize, going to the serious agreement with Iran, maybe these alliance structures really do tend to be linked. And instead of talking about the Quad, we ultimately get a much bigger, the Quad isn't just the US, Australia, Japan, and India, but maybe the UAE, maybe it's the
UAE,
quintet, and then Israel's there,
Israel,
it's the sextet,
Israel.
right? You have Greece there, it's the septet, and you have these other countries, they're all part of one body. That's there for
Like
this
Five
purpose.
Eyes,
I'm not
we
saying
can
it's the
make
only
10 eyes
possible
new
scenario,
10
but it's
eyes.
one.
Like Five Eyes concept, we can make new 10 eye concept, including
Yeah,
for
there you go.
Indo-Pacific as well as Middle East.
That's
And
right.
Israel and India
Exactly.
can do a lot in that
Yeah.
sense. But
Yeah.
I'm just worried why is the United States is losing its allies, or it's just trashing its allies or beating them like they are doing with Saudi Arabia, they are doing with UAE. That doesn't make sense diplomatically. That is the reason
Yeah, I'm
I always abuse their think tanks,
not a
Washington-based
big
think tanks.
fan. Not a big fan of the idea of a recalibration of U.S. policy with Saudi Arabia. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I can understand releasing the report about the Khashoggi killing. I can. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But the idea that you're on purpose, intentionally, consciously going to embarrass the Saudis and distance yourself from them doesn't seem to me to make any sense in the Middle East in
No, doesn't
2021.
make any sense.
I don't. I don't get it.
I think you have to go because your calls for your work is coming.
Yeah, it is true. We have to make sure we stay on TV. I have to go on live when I go on live, and I have to be ready. And you can't be 10 seconds late. So you're right about that.
Okay. Thanks a million. And
For
once
sure.
some more developments take place in Israeli politics, we will call you back again. And we are waiting for
Absolutely.
you
But
in India.
let me just finish on Israeli politics for a second, because I hope I didn't convolute it too much. I'll try to make it simple. Three scenarios: pro-Netanyahu government, anti-Netanyahu government, fifth elections. What's the big problem right now? The pro-Netanyahu government, he has 59 seats to get. He needs to get over the top of 61. He needs to support one way or another an Arab party. Within that 59, you have 6 seats that says that they're not interested in that. So you can't actually put all the cats, into one room, because one is going to
In
run
one
out.
bag.
Once you bring one in, the other runs out. So you can't actually get to the 61. And then you look at the anti-Netanyahu government. They have the same problem that I just mentioned, maybe to a lesser degree, but still there. But then their problem is not all of those 58 agree on a lot of things. They also disagree. They disagree on who should be prime minister, detailed, right? Among other things. So that's hard to make happen. And then there's the issue of the fifth election. All of that said, it's hard to put your finger on it, but there's something in the air that tells me maybe we won't go to a fifth election. Maybe there are politicians who are scared of it. Maybe there are so many moving pieces that one could move while we aren't watching. So it is possible something unexpected could happen, leading to one of those two governments coming into being. We'll have to watch. And I have to
Okay,
go.
Owen. Thanks a million.
All right. Bye-bye.
And we'll be back soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.